Good evening, everybody, and I have a very special treat for you this evening. I want to share with you a little bit about the history of NLP. So at this stage, you probably have some sort of an idea what NLP is in terms of the definition. But what I want to do here is I want to give you the history of how NLP has evolved, what the main components of NLP are, and my interest and fascination with that subject, which brings us to where we are today and why NLP at one level hasn't changed a lot in the last 20 years, but at another level, it is changing every single day. So I think giving you a perspective on the history will really bring that together and explain to you why I'm so intrigued and fascinated by the world of NLP. So if we go back to the very beginnings, the start, before NLP even was a twinkle in the eyes of the creator, there is a very important text called Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski, 1933. Now, this is the beginning of the idea that behavior was governed by people's thinking. And Alfred Korzybski talked about the fact that he believed that any mental illness or any challenge that people had around behavior or any challenge that people had around personality essentially comes down to people not being able to traverse logical levels of thinking in their environment. And around that time as well, Alfred Korzybski also postulated that at some stage in the future we would have a model for human thinking, which essentially is what NLP is. Its model explains how we think and how that thinking, that mindset results in the behaviors that we get and therefore the results we get. So that was kind of like a precursor to NLP back in 1933. Now, when it actually formed, first of all, what happened is that there was two people who were the main creators, actually three of them, but the main two people was Richard Bandler and John Grinder. Now, John Grinder was a linguistics professor, an English professor in the university, and Richard Bandler was a computer science student in the same university. And as well as being a computer science student, a programmer, he also had a fascination with Gestalt therapy. In fact, he was asked to help transcribe some lectures by a guy called Fritz Perls. Now, Fritz Perls was the father of Gestalt therapy. He did a lot of work with Gestalt therapy about helping people to heal up problems using this Gestalt model. And as Richard Bandler was transcribing the video sequences, the tapes of his interventions with clients, obviously back in those days, you'd pause and you'd play and you'd pause and you'd go back again. You'd be listening to these transcripts over and over and over again to type out the actual text. Nowadays, we just use rev.com or something like that. But back then, it was a very slow and tedious process. And it turns out that Richard Bandler was really good at picking up the signals that indicate how people do what they do. In other words, he was really good at modeling how people got results. So Richard said, I think I can do Gestalt therapy from watching Fritz Perls. So he, back then he didn't ask permission. He didn't wait to be certified. He didn't, ask if was it okay to do that. He just experimented. He actually did Gestalt therapy with people who volunteered, and he got really good results with it. So Richard and John got together and they formed an alliance to understand more about how this worked. And they end up writing the first two books on NLP, which is called The Structure of Magic 1, and then the second volume, which is The Structure of Magic 2. And what they did is they modeled how people worked on getting results in intervention. So it is basically coming from the world of therapy, effectively. Now, in the book, the first person they modeled wasn't actually Fritz Perls. It was part of that body of knowledge. It was actually a lady called Virginia Satir. Now, Virginia Satir was a very important lady in the history of NLP, because she was a family therapist, and she had this amazing ability to get really great clients with her really get great results for clients. And what they did is Richard Bandler sat down and he modeled her methodology as well, her model of how she got results with clients. And what he found was her secret was to get really, really specific in her language to clarify all the ambiguities in language. So people say, I was hurt. And she would say, well, how specifically were you hurt? And she would get really specific in the languaging that she would add to reveal what was not being said, to recover that lost information. And that became basically the first two major texts in NLP. It became Structure Magic 1 and then Structure Magic 2, which is leading on from that as well. Very detailed reads, worth having on your bookshelf if you really want to get deep into understanding the background to NLP. So at that point, it wasn't even called NLP. It was really about the structure magic, how you get results in therapy. Now, back then, you see, you have to remember that a lot of the therapy work that was happening in America was basically somebody sit down and listen, and the person would say something and they'd say, I'm feeling really depressed. And then the therapist would say to them, what I'm hearing you saying is that you're feeling depressed. And they would just repeat everything back to them. And it wasn't really getting results. It was a very nonsensical methodology for doing therapy. But that was one of the models that was used back in the 60s and 70s. And what Richard Bandler wanted to do was to create a model or models around actually getting consistent, repeatable results with people. And this is important. We'll come back to this later. So after modeling Virginia Satir, Richard and John Gwender said, okay, we've figured out how to get results in therapy. We know how to help people get over these obstacles and these challenges they have in their thinking by getting really, really specific. And then they came across another person that they wanted to model, which was a guy called Milton Erickson. Now, he's Dr. Milton Erickson. He was a medical doctor. But he also had this uncanny ability to use hypnosis in interventions to heal up all sorts of different problems with his clients. And he'd been practicing hypnosis since 1920s. In fact, he practiced hypnosis practically every day from the 1920s until his death in the 1980s. That's 60 years. And the way I think about it is like if somebody's practicing hypnosis for like 4, 5, 6, 7 clients a day for 60 years, you'd expect to be pretty good at it. Right. Now, Milton Erickson was a very important person in the history of NLP as well, because see, Milton Erickson was literally the person who single-handedly brought hypnosis from, the stage sort of just doing magic tricks and shows into being accepted as an accepted medical intervention to help people to get results and heal up conflicts and problems in their body. So he was massively important. So Richard and John sat down with Milton Erickson, and they started to model how he did what they did. Now, initially, they didn't actually get to speak to him directly. So they modeled him, again, same as Fritz Perls, by watching tapes of him and breaking down the structure of his language. And that became, the next 2 books in NLP became Hypnotic Language Patterns Volume 1, and then the follow-up was Hypnotic Language Patterns Volume 2, which is all about the hypnotic language patterns of Milton Erickson and how he got results with clients. Now, the thing is, this is really weird because Virginia Satir got results by getting really specific in her language, but Milton Erickson got results by being very artfully vague in his language, which is the other end of the spectrum at a much more abstract, logical level. So now we've got 2 different models of how to get results, and these became 2 of the main models in NLP back in the 1970s. Now, the next sort of evolution in the history of NLP was the discovery of eye patterns and how eye patterns led to understanding what people are thinking, which is really important because this actually helped with a whole thing about body language and incongruence. Now, the story of eye patterns, I want to share this with you because I found this out when I was over in America. Apparently what happened as a result of these first 4 books in NLP, Richard and John were doing a modeling exercise with the US military. It's probably one of the most famous modeling exercises done in the world of NLP, actually. And what they wanted to do is the military wanted Richard and John to come down and help to train young recruits, the new officers, on how to shoot with the shotguns and actually hit the targets. Because one of the problems was the guns they used back then, they used lead shot. And if the new recruits, the new officers who joined the ranks and were getting training using rifles, if they didn't have a good target, the lead shot wouldn't hit the target and fall into the little canister behind the target. It would go out into the grass or just go off at somewhere else, and it would be lost and it couldn't be recovered. So across the whole of the US, it was a massive cost of losing this lead shot, not being able to recover it for rifle practice. So what Richard and Bandler did is they sat down and they modeled some of the best riflesmen to get really, really good at working out how to get people really good at rifle practice very, very quickly by working out their thinking and their state and their behavior and exactly what they did to get a good shot. And that was a massive success for Richard and John Grinder. Now, I believe Tony Robbins was also involved in that particular modeling exercise. But during that process there, they worked very closely with the CIA. They were some of the people who worked with them on that team. And as they're sharing some of the techniques of NLP and how they model people, the CIA explained something to them, what they used in their interrogation, which is called eye patterns. So apparently, and I have this from an ex-CIA agent that I met in Orange County in America, that the CIA actually shared that information with John and Richard and Tony during that exercise, and that's where eye patterns originally came from. They'd been using for years for interrogation to be able to, ask people questions and then see where their eye patterns moved to see what they're actually thinking, what type of thinking they're using when they actually responded. So that became the precursor to the next big book in NLP, which is Frogs to Princes. So Frogs to Princes was the first documented book. I think it was about 1979, 1980, around then, maybe 77. So in the late 70s, Frogs to Princes came out, and that's the first NLP book that referenced eye patterns directly and how the eye patterns related to the representation systems and how people thought, whether they're thinking in a particular modality or another modality. So that became the next big chunk of knowledge in the world of NLP. So now we have meta model from Virginia Satir, getting very specific. We've got hypnotic language patterns from Dr. Milton Erickson. Now we have eye patterns as well from the book Frogs to Princes, which led on to strategies. Now, this is when a new person joined the group. That was a guy called Robert Dilts, who was very influential in that community at the time. And Robert Dilts wrote the book NLP Volume 1, which was about eye patterns, but also the order and sequence of these internal representations, these internal models of the world, how people internalized what was happening around them. And that became the book on strategies. So NLP Volume 1 became the book on strategies. Now, there was no NLP Volume 2 in this case. So Dilts was the main author of that particular volume. Now, that became a very important one because that was built actually on not just the foundations of NLP, but also the work on three other guys, George Miller, Pribram and Galanters. So Pribram and Galanters worked together on a book called Plans and the Structure of Behavior, and they came up with a model for explaining advanced strategies or advanced stimulus response. Now, around that time as well, we also had stimulus response that came from Pavlov. So Pavlov's work was brought into NLP around that time, and that became called anchoring. So the anchoring component of NLP was based on Pavlov's work in Russia, and that was all called anchoring. So a stimulus response anchoring process was brought into NLP. So now we have meta model, we have Milton patterns, we've got eye patterns, we have anchoring and how people become anchored and triggered, and the eye patterns leading into more complex behaviors. So stimulus response is understanding simple behaviors, simple stimulus response. Somebody gets triggered and they react a certain way. But when you've got a chain of these different things happening one after another, these stimulus response happening together, that was first referenced in the book Plans and the Structure of Behavior by Galanter Pribram and George Miller. And that was explained through something called the TOTE model. So then that made its way into the NLP Volume 1 book by Dilts, which explains strategies, which are complex behaviors beyond stimulus response. So now we've got simple stimulus response or anchoring, and we've got complex behaviors or chains of these stimulus responses, which became strategies in NLP. The next phase, or the next component that became systemized in NLP, was the book called Reframing. And Reframing really talked about the ability to change language, to change people's perspective using language. And that was another important. So with the book Reframing, and there's also a book called Transformations, which talked about the ability to induce trance to create change. And this became one of the pillar stones of the idea that all learning, change, and behavior is unconscious. That all the change, when you want to change something, we want to change something, people's personality, people's behavior, it has to be done at the unconscious level. Consciously telling people to change doesn't work. And you probably know this. If you ever tell someone to change, they don't change because you tell them. They change because the change happens at the unconscious level. So the cooperation of the unconscious mind became very important. Now, there's another couple of books there that became important. One called Magic in Action, and also one called Using Your Brain for Change. So these are the last sort of books in traditional NLP. Magic in Action and Using Your Brain for Change both focus on a new area, which was called Sub-Modalities, which is about understanding the finer distinctions or the properties of the main modalities in NLP. So now we've got a large range of different topics that explained human behavior and explained transformational change. We have very basics. We have the precision model or the meta model from Virginia Satir. So that was a model extract from Virginia Satir's work. We had hypnotic language patterns, which explained how hypnosis worked. That came from Dr. Milton Erickson. Then we had the eye patterns, which was documented in the book Frogs to Princes. And then we had anchoring from Pavlov, and that became that was Pavlov's stimulus response, became the section on anchoring. Then we had strategies, which is advanced anchoring effectively, or complex behaviors, which was documented by Robert Dilts. Then we had reframing, transformations, and finally we had sub-modalities, which was documented in the book Magic in Action and Using Your Brain for Change. Things went a little bit quiet then, but then two of Richard Bandler's first students, their first two master trainers, wrote a book together called Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality. And that brought in the time aspect of transformational change, which is a very powerful model for healing up past events in the past. So that was the basic fundamental part of it. And all of this then became the foundations of NLP. Now, since then, while the foundations hasn't changed, what has changed is the application of those foundations. Because essentially, what all of this gave us was a methodology of modeling how people got results. It started off with how Virginia Satir got results, Milton Erickson got results, how the CIA got results, how Glanders and Pribram and Miller got results, how Pavlov got results, how all these people got results, and they're extracting these models that could be taught and other people could get similar results from them. But what it really gave was an approach on experimentation and learning how people did what they did, how they got results. And then what happened is after about 1988, when Timeline Therapy and Basis of Personality came out, NLP broke off into a different form of teaching, because now it wasn't just about those 5 or 6 different models. It was about how we can apply this to how anybody got results. And this became the start of applying NLP outside of just therapy and performance. This led into areas like sales, for example. It led into areas like business development and business success. It led into leadership. It led into advanced communication. It led into presentation skills, and it led into many different industries, copywriting, for example, marketing and advertising and sales. So what's happened today is like NLP is no longer seen as a model about human excellence, but it's seen more as a tool for extracting how people get results and then using those models to be able to get the results yourself. So in some ways, the NLP model has been watered down because now it's got so many applications, so many different areas. And many of those areas are outside of the area of transformational change, which is our focus in Transforming People Academy, of course. So what we're going to focus on in this training course is we're going to go back to the foundations. We're going to go back to these areas that I've mentioned here, but understanding the foundations of language through Virginia Satir's model of how she got results by getting very precise in language. We're going to understand the basics of hypnotic language patterns of persuasion, which are very important in leadership and in management. We're going to look at the I patterns and strategies. We're going to look at the tote model and how the tote model explains complex behaviors and how people create the results by understanding the model of the order and sequence of the events that are happening, the experiences that are happening inside their head. We're going to look at sub-modalities. We're going to understand how sub-modalities encodes meaning in your life and how we can change meaning by working on sub-modalities. We're going to look at reframing, how we can reframe our experience and get a different perspective. And we're also going to look at timeline. We're going to look at how time changes things. You've heard the phrase, time changes everything. Well, we're going to show how we can actually accelerate time and do that in the immediate as opposed to waiting for time to pass. So that is essentially the history of NLP and how that leads into the foundations of NLP today. Now, once you understand this basic fundamental foundations, then you can start applying NLP to any area of excellence, any area of success, so that when you set your intention and your actions match that intention, you can get magical results in any area of life. And that's why I'm so fascinated by NLP. While the foundations of NLP may not be taught in many places today, they want to apply to like marketing, copywriting. Fundamentally, most advanced accelerated learning courses today, whether it's marketing or sales or stage presentations or copywriting or advertising or even therapy, are probably rooted in these basic fundamental models of how to extract a model from someone else's success, learn that model, tweak that model, and then teach that model, which becomes a model of excellence. So essentially what NLP really is, it's an attitude of being really curious how people do what they do inside. And then that wants an experimentation of trying to figure out how that works by testing it against other models, testing against with other people, saying, well, if you've got the result, if I do this, do I get the same result? So that attitude is really important. That attitude of being really curious of what goes on inside, and that wanting experimentation. And what you get from that is in a trail of techniques. Now, initially those techniques were the NLP foundations, but leaning on from those NLP techniques, now we've got thousands, if not millions, of different models of action that are used all over the world, from therapy to sales to advertising, copywriting, stage training, all sorts of things like that. So that is a nutshell. So we're going to use this then as our foundation going forward to learn more about these foundations and build a powerful model. So you can actually apply NLP to any area of your life, not just what I teach you. You can apply this model to learning about how to get excellence in any area by modeling somebody else and getting results in NLP. So hope you found that useful. Let's speak to you all in the next video. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.